culturally subversive act you could possibly commit today isn't, well, it isn't like a massive protest or quitting your job or writing some viral manifesto. What if the most rebellious thing you could do right now is to simply sit in the dirt and stare at a piece of tree bark for 15 minutes without looking away?
It sounds almost absurd when you frame it exactly like that. But in a society where our attention is, commodified, heavily tracked, and constantly auctioned off to the highest bidder, with holding that attention, just taking it completely offline, it really is an act of rebellion.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is exactly what we're exploring in today's deep dive. We're looking at a really fascinating manual called Rooted Wisdom, the Tree Observation Meditation Guide.
Right.
And we are specifically unpacking exercise 4, which is titled Deep Observation and Inner Stillness. Now, I want to be totally upfront with you, the listener, right now. You might be listening to this deep dive while you're commuting or, speed walking to a meeting or doing chores with your brain just running a mile a minute.
As we all do.
Right. You are likely in a state of manufactured human urgency. So my mission today, and okay, let's unpack this, is to look at how stepping outside of that specific urgency, using the really highly structured methods in this guide, can radically reset your perspective. Because we're basically functioning like we have 50 mental browser tabs open all the time.
Oh, at least 50. And they're all auto-refreshing.
Yes, constantly refreshing. And the whole premise of this guide is essentially to learn stability from what stays rooted.
Exactly. And structured is really the operative word there. This isn't just a vague suggestion to go take a nice walk in the woods and smell the pine needles. The guide is a very deliberate psychological tool. It anchors this particular exercise on one central premise, and I quote, "What is deeply rooted does not panic during changing seasons."
I love that quote so much.
It's powerful, right? It's not just about, looking at a nice piece of nature. It's about fundamentally changing the literal speed of our attention.
So, if depth requires us to slow down, how do we forcefully hit the brakes? Because, the guide demands a really strict logistical setup before the meditation even begins. Like, the architecture of this thing is intense.
Yeah, it doesn't leave a lot of room for wiggling out of it.
No, it doesn't. It mandates a dedicated 40 to 60 minutes. You need to be in a natural environment, so a forest, a mature garden, a riverside, something like that. And then there is the absolute non-negotiable rule. No phones, none. Not on silent, not in your pocket, left completely behind.
Which is terrifying for most people.
It is. And I have to ask, is it really strictly necessary to be that dogmatic about it? Can't someone just have their phone in their backpack on airplane mode? Come on.
What's fascinating here is that from a neurological standpoint, no, you really can't.
Wait, really? Even on airplane mode?
Even then. And here's why. Our smartphones basically act as a continuous, low-grade dopamine drip. Even if your phone is completely powered off, but it's physically in your pocket or your bag, your brain is still allocating spatial awareness and cognitive load to it.
Because it knows it's there.
Exactly. You are subconsciously anticipating a buzz or a notification. So by physically removing the device entirely from your environment, you are forcefully closing that loop of expectation. The guide explicitly notes that, depth begins when attention slows down, and you simply cannot slow your attention if a part of your nervous system is still standing guard just waiting for a text message.
Wow. Okay, that makes perfect sense. It's like trying to go to sleep while keeping one eye open just in case someone walks in.
It's a great way to put it.
So, okay, you've left the phone behind.
Yeah.
You are out in the woods, and the guide forces you into the very first action, which is step 1. You have to choose a tree.
Right.
And you have 5 minutes to do this. And my initial reaction when I read this was a bit dismissive. I thought, I'm surrounded by trees. I'll just pick the closest one. Is it really that hard to just pick a tree?
Well, the guide knows human nature too well.
It really does. Because it includes this fascinating restriction. It explicitly tells facilitators to instruct people to choose intuitively. And it absolutely forbids them from comparing the trees.
Yes. And that is probably one of the most psychologically astute elements of the entire manual. It specifically targets the maximizer mindset that modern life just beats into us.
Yes, the constant optimization of everything.
Exactly. We are so conditioned to believe there is always a better option available. If you go to pick a tree, your brain immediately starts optimizing. Is that oak tree too shady?
Does that birch tree have bugs on it?
Right. Or, would this pine tree look better if I wanted to take a picture later, even though you don't have your phone? This optimization process triggers decision fatigue, and it actually keeps your cortisol levels, your stress hormones elevated because your threat detection system is deeply linked to resource gathering.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah. So by stating right up front, Do not compare. The exercise immediately disengages that frantic, foraging part of the brain.
The facilitator quote in the text really nails this. It says, allow yourself to stay with one tree fully instead of many things partially.
It's beautiful.
It is. But once you sit down, the guide doesn't just say, okay, start staring at the bark.
Yeah.
There's a sort of transitional phase, right?
Yeah, you don't just jump into the deep end. It forces you to pause and do a diagnostic check on your own mental velocity. So the facilitator will ask you to, quote, notice the speed of your own mind.
Which is such a confronting instruction. I mean, I tried this, and you realize you sit down physically, but your brain is still just sprinting down the highway at 80 miles an hour.
And you have to remember that is completely natural. I think we often treat mindfulness as like a light switch.
Right. Like you just flip it and suddenly you're enlightened.
Exactly. We think we should be able to sit under a tree and instantly achieve Zen. But neurologically speaking, your brain has momentum. The default mode network, which is the part of the brain that's active when we are ruminating or worrying or, daydreaming, it takes actual time to power down.
So it's about acknowledging that momentum.
Right. This diagnostic step forces you to acknowledge that cognitive momentum without judging it. You can't successfully apply the brakes if you don't first realize how fast the car is actually moving.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The transition from merely looking at the tree to engaging in deep observation. The guide allocates a massive, 10 to 15 minutes to silently observe the visual details of this one single tree.
Which feels like an eternity when you're doing it.
I can imagine just staring at the bark texture, the way the branches fork, the shadows, the little bugs crawling on it. The way I visualize this is it's like the difference between quickly glancing at a painting in a museum as you walk by versus standing 2 inches away to study the individual brushstrokes.
Yes.
It's like the clutch in a manual transmission car. If your brain is the engine just revving uncontrollably, zooming in on the micro details of the tree's bark is stepping on the clutch, it disengages the gears of your anxiety from the engine of your mind.
That is a brilliant analogy. And what's great is there is a robust scientific framework backing up why that clutch actually works. In environmental psychology, there's a concept called attention restoration theory.
Oh, I've heard of this. It has to do with different types of focus.
Exactly. So most of our day requires what they call directed attention. Staring at spreadsheets, navigating through heavy traffic, reading 100 emails. Directed attention requires immense cognitive effort to block out distractions, and it depletes very, very quickly.
Which is why we're also exhausted by 3 p.m.
Exactly. But nature triggers something entirely different called soft fascination.
Soft fascination. I like that term.
It's a great term. When you watch a leaf tremble in the wind, or you study the chaotic, asymmetrical pattern of tree bark, your brain doesn't have to work hard to maintain focus. The stimuli are inherently interesting, but they aren't demanding. So your directed attention gets a chance to actually replenish. Yeah, the guide's specific instruction to, quote, observe as if you are seeing a tree for the first time. That's literally a mechanism to switch your brain from the depleting directed attention into the restorative state of soft fascination.
So you are basically tricking your brain into resting by giving it a highly detailed but zero-stakes task.
Precisely.
But the guide doesn't let you stop at the visual level, which I found so fascinating. It moves you into step 5, which is a sensory connection practice. It asks you to physically touch the bark, to feel the temperature difference between the shady side of the trunk versus the side in the sun, to lean in and actually smell the wood or the soil.
Yeah, it gets very tactile.
But why is that necessary? Isn't looking at it enough to trigger that soft fascination?
Looking is powerful, for sure, but it still keeps you in the role of an external observer. We live these largely visual and auditory lives through our screens, right? But touch and smell route through entirely different neural pathways.
How so? What's happening in the brain?
Well, smell, for instance, bypasses the thalamus and goes almost directly to the amygdala and the hippocampus.
Oh, the emotion and memory center.
Exactly. And when you engage touch and smell, you are sending massive amounts of sensory data to the somatosensory cortex. Your brain only has so much bandwidth. By flooding it with real-time physical sensory input from the present moment, you are literally pulling metabolic resources away from the prefrontal cortex.
Which is where all our hypothetical anxieties and endless rumination loops live.
Bingo. You are forcibly moving your consciousness out of the hypothetical future and planting it directly into the tangible present.
You're grounding the electrical circuit.
That's exactly what it is.
And this is where the absolute genius of the manual really reveals itself. Because up to this point, the entire, 30-odd minutes of the exercise have been directed outward, looking at bark, smelling dirt, feeling leaves. But then the guide uses all of that physical observation as a sort of Trojan horse to get past your emotional defenses. The observation suddenly flips inward.
Right. It introduces the tree as a psychological mirror.
Yes. It moves into step 4, symbolic reflection, and step 7, journaling. It takes those physical attributes you just spent 20 minutes studying and turns them into really poignant questions. It asks, what makes this tree stable? And then, what allows it to endure?
It's setting up the metaphor.
Exactly. And once you answer those, the guide flips the mirror onto you. It asks you to write down, what season of life am I in right now? Where am I trying to grow too quickly? What internal storms have I survived? And what parts of me are still growing silently?
Those prompts are so effective because they bypass our typical intellectual defenses.
Now, I guess if a therapist just sat down and asked me, what are your coping mechanisms? I feel like I'd just give him a rehearsed bulleted list.
Of course you would. We all have a PR firm in our heads that handles direct questions about our emotional state. We spin our own narratives, but the guide uses an indirect route.
The Trojan horse.
Exactly, because you have just spent half an hour building an intimate, sensory understanding of how this specific tree's roots, say, grip a rock to stay upright. Your brain is now primed to think in metaphors of structural integrity and patience. So when the question pivots to your own stability, you draw from that newly established, grounded metaphor rather than your rehearsed PR-approved anxieties.
That is so clever.
Yeah.
But okay, I do want to throw a flag on the play here because there is an optional advanced variation in the manual that made me raise an eyebrow.
The dialogue exercise.
Yes. It's a journaling prompt called Dialogue with the Tree. You are supposed to write down your answer to the question. If this tree could speak to me, what would it say? Now, tell me if I'm being too cynical here, but does this cross the line into fantasy? Are we encouraging people to think they are, telepathically communicating with an oak tree? It feels like it could veer into something very woo-woo or unhelpful.
No, it's a totally valid skepticism, and frankly, the authors of the manual anticipated that exact reaction. If you look at the facilitation guidelines in the text, there are explicit boundaries for this exact exercise. Facilitators are told directly, do not force spiritual interpretation, do not over-explain symbolism, and do not make it academic.
Okay, so they know it sounds a little out there and they're actively trying to keep it grounded.
Yes. Because clinically speaking, this isn't magic, it's a projective psychological technique. Think of the Rorschach ink blot test.
Oh, right, the ink blots.
Right, the ink blot doesn't actually mean anything. It's just a blank canvas that your subconscious projects its own hidden patterns onto.
So the tree is essentially a living ink blot test.
Exactly. When you ask, what would the tree say to me? Your brain logically knows the tree doesn't speak English. But because the tree represents patience, non-judgment, and endurance in your mind now, you are essentially asking your own subconscious, if I were infinitely patient and completely non-judgmental toward myself right now, what advice would I give myself?
Oh, wow.
It gives you permission to access a deep, quiet wisdom you already possess, but that you usually drown out with constant self-criticism.
That is incredible. By pretending the advice is coming from the bark, you strip away the self-doubt that usually accompanies our own intuition. You remove the pressure. I actually find that incredibly profound now that you explain the mechanism behind it.
It really is.
And what's wild is that internal shift, that sudden access to patience and self-compassion, it doesn't just stay in the journal. The guide claims this has a macro-level impact. It includes a whole section on the ecological justice connection.
Which is perhaps the most ambitious claim in the manual, right? Where this micro-practice of mindfulness attempts to bridge into global ecology.
Right. So what does this all mean? I have to push back a little here, too. The guide asserts that sitting in silence for an hour, reflecting on bark and roots, actually impacts ecological justice. How does a solitary, arguably self-focused wellness exercise translate to saving the planet? Isn't that a massive leap?
It definitely seems like a leap if we view environmentalism purely as a data-driven political exercise. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the manual argues that data alone doesn't actually change behavior.
Which is fair. We have all the data.
Right. We have known the statistics about climate change and habitat loss for decades, yet our trajectory hasn't fundamentally altered. The guide posits that ecological consciousness only deepens when people form an emotional, embodied relationship with living systems.
It states that we need to view, quote, nature as teacher, not resource alone.
And that is the core paradigm shift. Historically, modern industrial society views nature entirely as a warehouse. We look at a forest and see lumber or potential real estate or, at best, a pretty backdrop for an Instagram photograph.
Just resources to be extracted.
Exactly. But when you spend an hour observing the immense patience of a natural system, you develop actual cognitive empathy for it. You see how the tree shelters the insects, how its roots prevent soil erosion, how it manages its energy during a drought. You realize it isn't just an isolated object, it is an active participant in a deeply interdependent community.
So it moves environmentalism from an abstract concept in a textbook to a deeply personal kinship.
Yes.
You care about the ecosystem, not because some guilt-inducing documentary told you to, but because you have physically felt its texture. You've recognized your own struggles and your own seasons mirrored in its branches.
Exactly. You cannot sustainably protect what you do not truly know, and you cannot know something if you refuse to slow down and observe it on its own terms. The guide argues that true sustainability, both personal and ecological, requires this foundational rootedness. We have to stop viewing the natural world as something to be managed and start viewing it as something to participate in.
It's just a beautiful synthesis of personal therapy and planetary awareness. And that brings us to the way this manual wraps up the entire meditation experience. There is a closing reflection that the facilitator softly shares at the end of the hour. And it synthesizes all these complex layers, the architecture of slowing down, the diagnostic mirroring, the projective psychology, all into one final grounding thought.
And it directly confronts that relentless, urgent optimization mindset we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Yes, it does, the guy says. A tree does not compare its growth. It simply remains rooted while continuing to reach toward the light. It reminds the participant that a tree survives massive storms, scorching heat, and bitter droughts simply by maintaining its roots.
That doesn't panic.
It just holds on.
Right. And then it offers this redefinition that I just haven't been able to stop thinking about. It says, perhaps growth is not about rushing ahead. Perhaps growth is about learning how to stay grounded while expanding. It's the ultimate counter-narrative to our modern hustle culture. Growth isn't always forward motion. Sometimes the most vital growth is entirely invisible on the surface. It's the deepening of your root system so that when the weather of your life inevitably turns violent, you can hold your ground.
I think we all really need to internalize that, the idea that endurance without noise is a form of massive success. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to take back into your fast-paced reality. The guide asks us to observe a tree, to learn about silent growth and surviving storms. But consider what might happen if you applied this exact same framework of non-judgmental, intensely slow observation to an intractable problem or a difficult relationship in your own life right now.
Oh, that's an interesting challenge.
Right. If you stop trying to frantically solve, optimize, or rush your way through a deeply challenging season, and instead just sat quietly with it to observe its textures, its origins, and its roots, what hidden strength might you finally discover?